As head of the first Australian social democratic government since Australia helped to found the United Nations and to frame its charter more than a quarter of a century ago, I reaffirm our loyalty to both. Such pleasures are easily enough given, yet no nation makes them more sincerely, more earnestly today than Australia. No country needs more than Australia the fulfilment of the international objectives of the United Nations to reach the fulfilment of her own national objectives. There are few countries in which the paradox is demonstrated with such force that true national independence depends upon international interdependence. There are few nations to which the mirage of national self-sufficiency can be made so tempting, yet there are few nations for which that mirage can be so easily shattered. Australia, fortunate in possession of great resources, confident in the ability of her own people to develop those resources, is nevertheless not ashamed to admit her interdependence with her neighbours and her partners across the world and her dependence upon them. We are a people without illusions. We Australians neither falsely exaggerate our strengths nor fearfully exaggerate our weaknesses. It is precisely because we make a rational assessment of our strengths and weaknesses that we recognise that we depend upon a better international order to preserve those things we most value about our national independence. In seeking a better international order, we give primacy to the United Nations. It is therefore with growing concern that we witness what can only be called a drift away from international order and international cooperation at present occurring in world affairs. Australia's concern springs not just from the real difficulties created by recent events, but even more from the feeling that there has been a weakening of will, a loss of momentum in international determination to meet and overcome those difficulties.
Good afternoon and welcome to this Whitlam Institute webinar in conversation with Senator the Honourable Penny Wong, Reimagining Australian Foreign Policy. Today I am joining you from the Whitlam Institute within Western Sydney University, which stands on what was and what always will be the land of the Darug people of the Darug Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and welcome all First Nations people who are tuning in today. I wanted to share that footage of Prime Minister Whitlam at the United Nations as a reminder of what an engaged, open, constructive, comprehensive, strategic and respectful foreign policy looks like. Gough Whitlam changed the face of Australia and how we engaged with and were perceived by the world. Gough himself tasked this institute to, and I quote, help the great and continuing work of building a more equal, open, tolerant and independent Australia. And so one of the policy research themes we are engaged in is Australia in the world. Just this week, William Stoltz at the Lowy Institute in The Interpreter wrote, "The grandest ambitions of Australia's past aim to draw Australia into the centre of world power and overcome the separation and weakness born of Australia's tyranny of distance." He asks, what accounts for the decline of ambition in Australia's approach to world affairs, and how can we restore it? Today, we're delighted to have Senator Penny Wong, Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs and Leader of the Opposition in the Senate with us to discuss this and related questions. In July, Senator Wong wrote an essay in Australian Foreign Affairs. It was called "The End of Orthodoxy, Australia in a Post-Pandemic World." And it called for a new sense of purpose, urgency and ambition in Australian foreign policy. The essay has drawn much attention and was a shot in the arm for those of us who care about Australia's place in the world. Today's webinar will run till about 1:30 p.m. and it'll be in discussion format. I will ask the Senator a range of questions, some of my own and some advanced questions that you have sent in to us. and then we'll open the floor up for more of your questions to follow. So please, if you're unfamiliar with Zoom, make use of the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. So Penny, if you're ready, I might start with my first question.
Sure.
It's really hard to talk about vision and strategy in the middle of a crisis like the one we're in today, coming at us from a range of fronts. And yet you've written about reimagining Australian foreign policy. So I wanted to start off by asking you, what's your vision of the best Australia we can be in the world, for ourselves, for our neighbours, and for humanity as we go forward from this crisis?
Well, thanks, Leanne, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. And what a wonderful introduction, that footage of Gough, which really reminded us, you know, what we can be in the world, and really was very inspiring. And can I also, before I go to your question, acknowledge country and just say I'm speaking to you from Kaurna country, the people of the Adelaide Plains, and acknowledge their custodianship of this land and their continued custodianship of this land. Thank you for that question. 2 points I want to make about that. First, it is hard to talk about strategy in the crisis, but in many ways it's one of the most important things we can do to make sure we understand not just the immediate and urgent problems, but what the longer term strategic shifts which are occurring around us, and preparing ourselves and committing ourselves to action that deals with that effectively. What is the best Australia we can be? I think I have said self-reliant and ambitious. We need to accept the urgency that faces us. We need to commit ourselves to a foreign policy that has more ambition. We have to commit ourselves to renewing multilateralism. We have to exercise what I've described as true leadership. And we have to, I think, in terms of to end on the question you asked, what's the best Australia we can be? I have a view that foreign policy is obviously an expression of the assertion and prosecution and protection of one's national interests and values. It is also an expression of identity. And you saw that actually in Gough's introduction, in Gough's speech there. The way in which he talked about our foreign policy position, you know, how we wanted to engage in the world was intricately and deeply connected with and driven from who we are. And that is how we should think about our foreign policy. You know, we are a vibrant, multicultural, dynamic nation. We're a nation that has at its best views about human rights and equality. We have a view about the world and the sort of world we want to live in. We have a view about the importance of nations working together. We are supporters of peace. We are supporters of shared prosperity. We are supporters of a world in which countries and peoples can be what they aspire to be. And so we need to bring that identity to our foreign policy. Yeah, I think that is what I would say about, you know, what is the best Australia we can be.
Thanks, Penny. Penny, when I left school in the early 1990s and I was trying to decide what to do with my life, the advice was study languages, particularly Asian languages. More people like me studied Bahasa Indonesia then than Australians do now when they go to university. A concern's been raised by one of our audience that we seem to have gone backwards in demonstrating through language and cultural competence that Australians are interested in engaging with the world beyond our comfort zone. And certainly in my experience, we're often typecast internationally as monocultural and monolinguistic as a nation, detached from our own region. I wanted to ask you, how important do you think cultivating a globally curious, literate and culturally respectful next generation is going to be for Australian foreign policy?
I think it's one of the critical competencies of the era we face and the challenges we face. So, and, you know, perhaps I should just very quickly talk about that. I mean, I think given the pandemic, and I assume we'll come to it, but for a whole set of reasons, I think we face a a less stable, a more divided and a riskier world. I mean, we have the biggest global crisis since World War II, the largest economic downturn since the Great Depression, rising nationalism, fraying multilateralism, and escalating competition between the great powers. And navigating that is a more challenging strategic environment than Australia has faced since the end of World War II. So what are the things we need to do in that? They are many. But one of them, I think, is to leverage our own strengths much better. I think our multiculturalism and our cultural diversity is a strength we do not leverage, either in how we present ourselves to the world, nor in the sorts of competencies we value, both in the public and private sectors. Asian languages is a small example of the way in which government policy and government leadership matters, both in terms of what is funded, what priority is given, and the way in which people speak about it. And I remember Kevin Rudd refunding the National Asian Languages Strategy. That's not the entire title. It was called NALSIS. It's one of those acronyms I can't recall, but which was defunded by the previous government. We've not seen sufficient support for Asian language study. We had a recent issue with Assisi's, the Indonesian study facility, which the government belatedly funded after an outrage from academics and others. But I think it's more than just funding, which is obvious. I think it is also how we talk about ourselves. One of the points I make in the essay that you referenced is, I said, we do best in our region when we move from them to us. And moving from them to us is about perspective. It's about identity. And some of the things you reference are aspects of that. Mm-hmm. But fundamentally, it's to not think of ourselves, in the way some countries, some do think about us, which is, as you said, culturally detached from our region. This is the region in which we live. This is where our security and prosperity will come from.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you on a related point. It goes again to, I suppose, competencies for foreign policy. Your essay talks about the need to increase representation of Australia and Australians at senior levels in international and regional organisations. We've had a question from someone about why Australia doesn't support young Australians looking at multilateral careers through, for example, the UN Young Professional Program, the Junior Professional Officer programs, both of them basically the equivalent of a DFAT career path graduate traineeship. So many other nations do this to their advantage in the short and the longer term. And related to this, on the other end of the international experience spectrum, you must know as well as I do, if you go to any development, humanitarian or peace and security setting, you'll find amazing Australians doing astonishing work across so many different fields for so many different organisations. But it's a common experience that there's really no place for those Australians to come back to here where they can share what they've learned in those contexts. This is obviously incredibly valuable first-hand intelligence for Australia about country contexts where we may not have a big presence, for example, but it's not well recognised and it's not utilised. So I wanted to ask if you have any ideas about how a Labor government might support Australians looking for careers in international affairs and how you might make sure Australia gets the best possible dividend from those experiences and networks that are built.
That's an excellent question, and what I'd also invite in response, because people who are doing this probably have a better granular and practical understanding of what could be done, is to invite people to someone to send stuff to me about some of those programs and what the what ideas we could utilise in respect of them. But can I make some broader points? The first is, as Gough said at the outset, we need a multilateral system that works. I mean, we are what I've described as a substantial power. Some say a middle power. We have global interests, but we are not a global superpower. Therefore, one of the central ways in which we have to express that interest and assert that interest is by being active in multilateral institutions and by being effective and constructive multilateralists. Now, as you say, we're actually pretty good at it. We have a history of it, but you're right. If you go to if you observe, as I have been privileged to, lead delegations to multilateral fora when a minister, or if you observe both NGO and also within the multilateral system, Australians are extremely good at practical creativity within the multilateral system. Now, I would want, tell you one thing I would want us to value that more. I would want that to be a priority for DFAT, and I would want that to be a capability that the Department of Foreign Affairs actually demonstrably valued in terms of where their intake is from and who is promoted. That, you know, that is actually one of the central priorities that a Labor government would bring. The second point I'd make, which references back to the essay, I wanted to get beyond just the phrase, we need to renew multilateralism and recommit ourselves to it, because I think, well, I'm not sure the government necessarily agrees, but most people do agree with that. What are some of the practical ways we can do that? And certainly making sure we do our best to resource with the pragmatic, creative talented Australians we have in the institutions that matter. It seems to me to be a very practical way of contributing to that renewal of multilateralism. So the sort of career paths that you describe, I'd certainly be interested in hearing more from the audience about what they think we can do better and what the current department is not doing on that front.
So Penny, 2020, as you would be well aware, is the 75th anniversary of the UN. Sadly, given the way 2020 is unfolding, there's been very little opportunity to celebrate the UN's achievements. And it seems that in Australia, the conversation is limited in range from one perspective around negative globalism, for example, to the other end of the spectrum really being about how we can advocate for fixing a broken multilateral system, which is certainly true to a degree. But do you think there's any real understanding in Australia, or do you think we can enhance some understanding in Australia about the contribution that the UN makes every day to humanity, from vaccinations against deadly disease to peacekeeping, from regulating trade, maritime boundaries, postal services, educating children, supporting maternal health, protecting refugees, running elections? What do you say to the idea that Australia shouldn't just be part of fixing the multilateral system, but first and foremost, perhaps standing up for what it does and what it stands for, the way Gough did so eloquently in that video we saw at the beginning?
We absolutely should. And I try not to be too partisan in these sorts of forums, but I think the concept of negative globalism was yet another slogan, probably devoid of meaning other than, sort of playing to a sort of isolationist constituency, but also completely contrary to our national interests. I think when I talk about renewing multilateralism, I think it is not just saying that the system is broken. It is renewing our commitment to it. It is renewing some of the institutions that I think we can do better with. But it is also about being steadfast in our advocacy for the principles that underpin it and our advocacy for its key institutions. So I was very critical of the Trump administration for its withdrawal from the World Health Organization. I think the recent actions of the Trump administration to sanction judges from the International Criminal Court I think the action of the Trump administration to sanction judges was appalling. I think it is an institution that we support. It is an institution that is about international law, and Australians should always step forward and say that we support the multilateral rules-based system. Your point is a good one. I think we could do better with advocating or getting people to understand what the United Nations does. But I don't see this so much as a marketing campaign. I think this actually ultimately comes back to our national interest. Do we want a world where nationalism rules, where there are essentially no rules that govern behaviour, where raw power is not ameliorated by collective agreement and collective solution? Or do we want a world which is the one we envisaged as a nation when we were part of the establishment of the United Nations, where we do have a system that provides for common responses to common threats or collective responses to common threats, and avenues for dispute resolution which are not predicated only on power. I mean, that is the world we want to live in, and we should do all we can to bolster it. I mean, the problem we've got at the moment is we've got great power competition with both powers having not having an interest in championing the current order. No, I mean, obviously China doesn't, has its own set of great power interests. The US under President Trump doesn't have an interest in championing the existing order. So for Australia, we have to work with other nations who do. And I think that's important to remember that. Like in a time that is pretty depressing in many ways, I think globally, the most depressing thing being, of course, in a 1 in 100-year pandemic, the global humanity needed a multilateral response. It needed a collective response, needed the sort of response we saw in the GFC, but bigger, across both economic and fiscal, but also public health front, and now in the vaccine. And at a time we needed that, what we saw was rising nationalism, conflict, competition, and fragmentation. And the cost of that will be measured, and is being measured, in more poverty and more lives.
Yep. Penny, let me turn to the region now, if you don't mind. You've talked about the reduced focus in our foreign policy on Southeast Asia, and also the need for us to support Southeast Asia's COVID recovery as well. In your essay, I think you said that focusing on the Pacific at the expense of Southeast Asia would be an own goal. And we'd love to hear from you on that. But I wanted to add, our research on perceptions of Australia in the Pacific indicates that we aren't even getting that right, that whatever we think we are to the region is very different to how we're perceived, with perceptions of neo-colonialism, racism, disrespect, and lack of cultural understanding limiting our effectiveness, no matter how much money we throw. So Pacific Islanders told us that they wanted the step up to be something Australia does with the region, not for it or to it. So I wanted to ask you, how might a Labor government shift the step up or change the step up to address those concerns, noting, of course, that the #1 security concern in the Pacific is climate change?
Climate change, yes. Well, I think that let's start with, I guess, the stance, which is what you referenced. Again, it's sort of us and them, isn't it? Again, I think we do best in the Pacific if we talk about and we think about it and we act consistent with that intention, that we are working together. We're not just the big brother helping. I think that to be a partner of choice, which is what we aspire to be, we have to be authentic in how we engage, and that authenticity goes to purpose. Our purpose is not simply strategic or pragmatic. Our purpose is we recognise our relationship with the region, and we share their desire to alleviate poverty, to prosper, and to confront or to deal with some of the great challenges they face. It is impossible for a government that has the position it has on climate change, that this government has, to engage with the Pacific with that degree of authenticity. I often comment that people, and I remember this from when I was climate change minister many years ago. For Pacific Island nations, climate change is an existential issue. It is a development issue. It is a national security issue. And if we treat Pacific Island nations without recognising the centrality of that, as this government does, I don't think there's any possibility of a step up which actually garners the sort of partner of choice sense to it that Australia needs. In addition, I would make the point that the cuts to development assistance and the own goal you described, which is reducing our assistance to Southeast Asia to fund the Pacific step up, but even within that, funding that through cuts to Papua New Guinea and even to Fiji. I mean, these are short-sighted. they're both, you know, there's obviously an ethical element. I happen to believe that trying to, you know, avert deaths which can be avoided, whether they're maternal deaths or children or people dying from preventable diseases, is a kind of good thing for humanity. But leaving aside those points, there's a strategic purpose, which is we do want to be a partner of choice. Our security comes from ensuring that we do what we can to make our region more secure and more prosperous. And, you know, if there's a vacuum, we know that there are others who will fill that space.
Mm. Penny, we've got a lot of questions coming in.
I saw that. The numbers are growing.
Yeah.
29. I don't know. What do you want me to do?
That's all right. That's all right. I'm going to try and
pull
together a few.
I'm going to let you deal with that.
Okay. So obviously, unsurprisingly, several questions around Australia and China and Australia and the US. So obviously we're seeing tensions escalate in the last couple of days in relation to journalists and academics. But more broadly, your essay talks about the risk of Australia being caught in the slipstream of strategic competition between the US and China. Stephen Fitzgerald, Australia's first ambassador to China, delivered the Whitlam Oration in 2017 on Australia and China in an age of disruption, and he was, as expected, quite prophetic. He said then that we need a relationship with China comparable to those with other major powers because we're living in a Chinese world and we don't have the relationship to match it. And he recalled that when he first met Gough in '67, Gough said to him, "We can't think clearly about China if we can't think clearly about the United States." So in that context, you know, you've made clear that you think Australia needs to be more self-reliant in how we define our national interest. So would you be able to say anything more about what you think that would look like today as opposed to then? What's the way back from the precipice with China, if that's what it is? And how do we go about building more strategic, long-term and trustful relationships?
Look, first to recognise we're in a very challenging place, and since that oration 2017, things have deteriorated, and the deterioration, I think, reached a new low with the events in relation to the Australian journalists. So,
without doubt.
Yeah, there's a number of points into your question. I'll just try and deal with some of them. The first is strategic competition between the great powers, which is escalating, which I think has been accelerated and intensified by the pandemic. And the point I made is we cannot view our foreign policy entirely through that binary prism. And in fact, it is highly risky for us to do so. People talk about, you know, us having to choose, and I'd say, well, we've already chosen. We're a US ally, but that is not the end of the matter. The second point is that we are not the only nation facing the challenges of this strategic competition, and we are not the only nation who doesn't want to define its strategic position entirely by that binary. Or rather, its foreign policy entirely by that binary. So we do have to work with what I've described as allied and aligned nations. I think Maurice Payne says like-mindeds, whatever phrase you use, it is engaging with other parties, other nations, to ensure that we seek to shape the region we want and seek to shape the world we want through that, through engagement in regional fora, in multilateral fora, and in various minilaterals or plurilaterals around issues in which we care about. The relationship with China I've described as I've said, look, we do want a productive relationship with China, and a productive relationship is one in which our interests and our values are respected, and equally recognising China's interests and values. It does, I think, require a certain degree of pragmatism and recognising, particularly under President Xi, that China's stance has shifted. It is much more assertive about its interests, which is to be expected, frankly. That's what great powers do. And some of the assertion of those interests do not correlate with Australia's interests. And so the challenge for the relationship is how do we manage those differences in a context of a relationship which does matter to us. And it matters to us, and I have made this point a few times, because there's a lot of discussion, domestic discussion about China, which recognises some of the challenges, but seems to have as an unspoken that there's some option around disengagement. China isn't going away, and there is no aspect of our economic or strategic future to which China is not relevant. and we have to deal with that. Now, that doesn't mean, it certainly can't involve us shifting from positions which matter to us. We are always, as a democratic country, going to have a view about human rights, which manifests in terms of our discussion about the Uyghurs and Hong Kong and so forth. We have a view about the international law, which manifests as a discussion about the South China Sea. But we do have to work at how do we, in a new phase of the relationship with China, which is what I talked about last year, although I didn't anticipate it being quite so challenging as it is now, how do we manage difference within the context of a relationship that is a given for us?
Penny, I'm just going to take another question that's getting a lot of support right now relating to the US, more to the US. So Nick Whitlam's actually written in and has asked, insofar as the present government's foreign policy effectively mirrors and follows US foreign policy, how would a Labor government differ from US policies, particularly with respect to China and Palestine?
Well, first, in relation to when we're asserting self-reliance and ambition, I think it reflects an aspect of Labor foreign policy tradition, which is we support the alliance of the United States, but we are willing to assert our views within the context of that alliance, even when they are not the same. Obviously, in relation to the Trump administration, that there have been a number of occasions where we have and we should. There have been past occasions, as you know. Both parties of government at times have disagreed with the US administration. I'm not sure. To me, my view is the current government's foreign policy isn't particularly coherent, in part because there's a lot of domestic political considerations in terms of how they operate and how they message, and I think that is problematic. We have, I've expressed the view I have today in relation to the Trump administration's actions on the sanctioning International Criminal Court prosecutors. I previously expressed our view in terms of the World Health Organization, why you would pull out of the Global Health Organization in the midst of a one-in-a-century pandemic. I think nothing is improved by vacating the space. So, I think our relationship is with the nation. We have differences of views at times, and they have to be asserted. It was interesting, I thought, that Marie said what she said at AUSMIN, where she talked about, in the context of some quite strong language from Secretary Pompeo, she made the statement, that we don't wish to injure our relationship with China, which I thought was one of the, it was a clear differentiation point, which was unusual for the government. On Palestine, that's been well documented, the discussion within the Labor Party about how we would deal with recognition and recognising where the national conference is, but recognising also these are issues that a future Labor government would need to determine, but continued support for a just two-state solution. I would make the point that we have previously expressed our view about annexation, and I think the government did make some statement post us saying so, but obviously annexation such as was contemplated and articulated by the Prime Minister Netanyahu is not consistent with a negotiated two-state solution.
I'm going to return to the region for a second, Penny. In terms of regional cooperation, the Asia Pacific does lag behind other parts of the world. What do you think are the prospects for strengthening regional cooperation in the Asia Pacific through ASEAN, through the Pacific Island Forum and other fora? And how can Australia earn a respected and valued place at the table?
Well, the crisis gives us an opportunity to be a constructive player, and it's not one that we've really taken up. And the point I've made, both in the essay but more broadly, is that we have a region which is both, is experiencing and will continue to experience enormous challenges in both economic recovery and in terms of the public health response to the pandemic. And whilst we cannot fix all of it, we can play a much stronger role in galvanising a regional response and a multilateral response to those challenges, and we should, because I saw some of the recent economic statistics out of some of the ASEAN nations. India, for example, also has taken a huge economic hit year on year from the last figures. Now, again, I say Australia can't make all of the difference, but we can do much better than we have. We were integral to the G20 response to the GFC because of the activism of Prime Minister Rudd. We should have been and should be integral to both the public health and economic response to what is occurring, the challenges that Southeast Asia is experiencing. Now, some of that, you mentioned architecture, which forums. ASEAN obviously is a very important forum, one we can engage with, but we should not think about only engaging with ASEAN as a bloc and as an entity. We need to work important bilateral, plurilateral relationships within ASEAN. And really, how do we do it? Well, let's listen to what the region themselves are saying. I noticed Foreign Minister Masudi tweeting out about her meeting with the Chinese Foreign Minister. And what did she talk about? She said, 1, we want collaboration on vaccine development. 2, we want economic revival as a shared priority. And 3, we want respect for international law, including the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, that is from the Indonesian Foreign Minister. It is a very clear articulation of one of our principal partners' interests in the region. And where are we? Well, you know what we're doing? Before the pandemic hit, we cut aid to Indonesian health programs by 80%. I mean, it is an own goal. As I said, leaving aside our humanitarian response about saving lives and averting preventable diseases, it is an own goal from a strategic perspective because we have an interest and our security is dependent upon a secure and stable Indonesia, amongst others.
Mm. Some questions coming in, as you would expect, around DFAT capacity. I think it's fair to say that in the last decade, in Australia and other parts of the world, we have witnessed a kind of militarization of foreign policy, with debates focused around security strategies and resources shifting to defence capabilities over other forms of engagement. What impact do you think COVID might have on that framing that we've become so familiar with? And how can we move to a more multifaceted balance of engagement in our relationships?
Well, that's the key, isn't it? What the phrase you last used, multifaceted balance in our relationships. And I think Michael Wesley talks about, using all the levers of Australian foreign policy. So, yes, obviously investment in our strategic capability matters at a time where we've seen more instability. But it is not the only tool we have. Diplomacy matters, soft power matters, engagement matters, personal relationships matter. And I thought it was quite instructive. I saw reported in the media, frankly, a very similar line from Francis Adamson, the Secretary of DFAT, about the importance of diplomacy, backed in from memory. If it wasn't by Angus Campbell, it was someone similar. And the point is, we don't want to be in the position of having to use some of the capability we're investing in. And the best thing we can do to avoid that occurring is to invest in our diplomatic capability and our soft power and our relationships. So it's important to make those investments. The recent announcements had bipartisan support, but that is not the only thing we need to do.
Penny, we talked about multilateralism and global cooperation. I've got a question from Claire. There are these things called the Sustainable Development Goals. For those listening who have never heard of them, because a lot of people in Australia haven't, it's the global plan to reach by 2030 some pretty big targets around economic, social and environmental sustainability. Now, in Australia, given what we've seen this year between fires and drought and COVID, the need to see the interconnectedness between those things in our context is pretty obvious. Australia signed up to these 17 goals in 2015. We submitted a voluntary report in 2018. Yet they're largely unknown across Australia. There is very little federal leadership on implementing the goals or even setting up a framework to implement the goals. or to use them as a tool, an international hook to help improve the lives of ordinary Australians. Does the ALP have a position around the SDGs? Is this and should this be a serious commitment for Australia, given that we've signed up to it?
So I think that these are the the next generation from the MDGs, and they are a tool that I looked at in the last term of opposition, and I think that there is some, given global agreement around them, there's certainly, I think, utility in those as a tool for analysis and assessment of policy and articulation of goals, both in terms of your development assistance framework, which I think we need, wholesale work on if we were to win government. But I have to say I found it hard, and maybe it's my former finance minister hat, to work out how you would integrate them into domestic policy assessment, because they are quite, it potentially is quite a complex process of working out how you might look at applying those to your domestic policy framework. I don't believe much of that work's been done. I asked some questions of Prime Minister and Cabinet, I think, in the last term about where it was, and he said, yes, I think they were working on it, but nothing ever came to fruition. I have wondered, in terms of some areas of policy, whether they would be a useful tool to, align policy objectives, particularly, around closing the gap in health policy in particular. I think they read, they're very compelling in terms of the outcomes that they seek to establish. It would be, I think, quite hard to get the Australian public service focused on them, I suspect.
Yeah, it's true. There was a Senate inquiry that finished up at the end of last year that made a whole lot of recommendations, none of which have been taken up. What we're seeing in the research is that it's actually the private sector who's taken these up much more seriously and incorporating them into their work, and local community groups as well. So, I had a question come in from New York from James Cocaine from the UN University Centre for Policy Research. And the most popular question on our Q&A feed at the moment is related to the same thing. So this is really about, James notes that Sweden and Mexico have both launched feminist foreign policies. France and Luxembourg have theirs under development, and both the Canadian and UK Labor parties have a feminist international development policy. Given what we know about, and you've already mentioned, the impacts of global crises on women and girls in particular, and women's effectiveness in forming solutions for some of these problems, is it time for Australia to have a feminist foreign policy?
Well, we should have a foreign policy which reflects our identity and our values and our national interests, which I think we started with, and they include gender equity. And that should inform how we operate multilaterally, it should inform how we operate in the region, and it should, in the most granular sense, I think, should inform how our development assistance is the architecture and delivery of our development assistance program. I would make the point that I think, from a feminist perspective, multilateralism is pretty important. So I see the renewal of multilateralism as being completely consonant with what a feminist foreign policy would look like. I would say this though, I don't think we have, and there might be people who are better development policy experts than I on this Zoom, but it doesn't seem to me that currently we have worked out best how we use our development assistance program to further women's empowerment and particularly women's economic empowerment and women's security. In part, it's also because we keep cutting the program. We're $11.8 billion has been taken out since they came to government, and even Julie Bishop has been critical of it. But I recall, so apart from this job, I also have been involved in UN Women for many years, and through that, we have contributed in terms of funds we raised to an Australian government program which was around supporting women, democratic participation. And there was a particularly poignant moment for me when in one of the nations in which we had worked with UN Women and the Australian government had worked with a number of women standing for Parliament, and none of them were elected. And it seemed to me there's a certain kind of that's poignant, but what it tells us is you can't just take an individual or liberal feminist view about how you actually remedy disadvantage, because there are fundamental structural, economic and personal security issues that were always, and cultural issues, which were going to impinge upon their capacity to take a leadership role, which would have been of benefit, I would have thought, to have more women in leadership. So, I think there is a deal of policy work to do to think through how do we best resource women and girls as a country for whom gender equity matters.
Mm. All right, I'm going to take another question from all of these ones coming in here. Irene Munro asks Penny, what are your views regarding the position that Australia should take in forums such as the upcoming G20 with respect to aid and or debt, i.e. deferring or waiving debt in terms of supporting low-income countries in the region?
Well, I think that's one policy proposition. I would go with the central policy proposition, or the central objective, which comes back to the recovery and what is the best economic and fiscal response that we can galvanise to enable nations to recover. And what you do with debt is part of that discussion. I suppose the most recent, as I said, the most recent positive example of this was the G20's architecture of, or design of, or coordination of the response to the GFC, which I'd just make this point, when fiscal responses are coordinated, when economic responses are coordinated, you get better bang for your buck. So I think having a very coherent look at what do the countries of the need region want, what are they asking for, what would be economically effective given that we will be living with this pandemic for some time, what is the best way in which that response can be designed and coordinated. And obviously countries' exposure to debt and the potential of financial contagion, which I also went to in my essay, are risks we have to deal with.
I've got an interesting question, Penny, that's coming from Eric Sheng about the Indian Ocean. He says the Indian Ocean seems to be even more neglected than Southeast Asia, for example, in relation to Australia's silence over the disastrous oil spill in Mauritius. Do you have anything to say around that element of our foreign policy or our relations there?
I think that's true. I think we, in particular, I think there was one thing that Julie Bishop, being a Western Australian, talked about a bit, and certainly it's one of the ways in which we have sought to engage with India. But I think it is a pretty reasonable criticism to say that there has been a much greater focus on, I suppose what you'd call the Asia-Pacific region, particularly since the pandemic. But I think that's a reasonable proposition. But can I just come back and say, I think this comes down to the point about allied and aligned nations and who we work with on what. My view about it is we should be thinking about what are the things that are core to our national interests, what do we want to prioritise, who shares these, and how do we work with them on it. And the Indian Ocean, probably one of the things that we most want to ensure is to ensure that the law of the sea and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is reflected in some of the, I was going to say disputes, but, pressures in that region, in that domain.
A security question for you now, because we haven't touched much on that side of things. Somebody wants to know your views in relation to a recent ASPI report, which recommends that Five Eyes countries adopt a collective economic security measure, analogous to Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, a pact that would enable them to use their collective intelligence arrangements to make authoritative joint attributions of coercive measures levied against any one member, and to facilitate collective economic and diplomatic responses. Is this something that you've looked at?
I mean, look, I think expanding Five Eyes cooperation across domains is probably, what do you call it, unremarkable in many ways. But I do want to just, I suppose, sound a slight note of caution around some of the way in which this ends up in a discussion about supply chains and, I suppose, economic disengagement. There is a reasonable discussion as a consequence of what happened in the pandemic and as a consequence of escalating great power competition about whether existing global supply chains serve the purpose that we wish them to serve. And the pandemic has exposed the vulnerability of supply chain, and it's also, it is also one of the ways in which some of the great power competition is being played out. I think it is quite important that we are very clear about what are the things we want to have different arrangements around and the reasons for that, rather than a general proposition about decoupling or disengagement. So the reality is that Australia is a trading nation, and we are a nation which depends on international economic engagement and integration. We will take longer to recover, and Australians will be poorer and fewer will be employed if we take an isolationist approach. Having said that, there are certain areas where we recognise there are strategic implications, and we would want, I think, to cooperate with like-minded nations in relation to those industries and supply chains which are strategically relevant to us. But I do worry sometimes that some of the discussion kind of devolves into a sort of decoupling from China or decoupling from other nations in a way that I don't think is in our national interests.
Limiting. Penny, we're coming up to time, so I'm just going to throw you one last question from the people who've joined us today, and it goes back to what we were talking about in terms of multifaceted approaches, the challenges of multifaceted approaches, particularly in relation to national identity. So the question is, if we're to adhere to Australia's identity as a nation, does it not necessarily follow that we stop selling weapons to countries committing war crimes? Obviously, this question is raised in the context of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen.
Well, first, I mean, we've previously, and I would continue to urge the government to support the UN effort to find a political solution to the conflict in Yemen. We should assure ourselves that any military cooperation in the region, including in terms of defence, sales of defence equipment, doesn't contribute to the suffering of civilians. I've asked questions about this in estimates. We've been given repeated assurances that permits to export are assessed consistent with the objectives in the existing legislation, and assessed with regard to the risks they could be used to commit human rights abuses. Whether or not the current legislation is sufficient, I suppose, is a matter that people have been arguing for some time. But in terms of the accountability of the government on this, that remains their response to those questions. I mean, it is an ongoing, and I mean, the conflict is, it hasn't had as much focus in recent times because of, we're so focused on so many other things, but that is an ongoing and very concerning situation, very distressing situation.
Penny, you have answered a very wide range of questions with us now. I just wanted to give you a last chance if there's anything else that you wanted to mention before we wrap up.
Oh, I need to say I really welcome these events because I wasn't trying to amp it up when I've said that I think we need to bring the same urgency to foreign policy that we brought to our public health and economic response to the pandemic. I think the pandemic is reshaping the world in which we live. And the counterfactual to us stepping up isn't the status quo. The counterfactual is others will shape it for us. And so if we care about, and we do deeply, the sort of region we want to live in and we want our children to live in, and the sort of world we want our children to inherit, then we really have to bring a much greater sense of leadership and purpose to our foreign policy. And that can only happen, not only, I think, with a government that's prepared to do that, but with a foreign policy community that is interested not only in an intellectual theoretical discussion, but in a purposive discussion about what we do. So thank you for the opportunity, and I hope that's given people some food for thought.
I'm sure it has. And again, thank you for your time. We know how busy you are, and for being so frank in your responses to my questions.
I always worry when people say that. I think, what did I say that I shouldn't have said? When they say, being so frank, oh dear.
It was a compliment. It was a compliment. So thank you too to everybody who joined us. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all the questions, but I hope we touched on several of them. And we look forward to seeing you all again at our next webinar. Thank you again, Penny, on behalf of everyone who's here.
No worries. It was great. Thank you. Cheers.